There's a list of phone numbers, so I know who to call when something breaks. And I remember I gave a sermon on the late Surgeon General C. Everett Koop, and I mentioned that he designed surgical equipment. And once you design it, you have to have somebody make it. And one of the guys in our church up here in this black shirt over here, John, stand up, John. He knows how to make surgical equipment. If something breaks, he knows how to fix it. When the theater group needed a stage set, he knows how to make it. If you want a boat, he can make you one. If you want a house, he can build you one. People like that I find embarrassing. I don't want my wife to know that there are men out there who know how to do those things. But John has recently built a house in South Carolina. It's not quite finished. But his wife, I thought his wife, Carol, I'm looking for Carol, I don't see her, she's not working. She's working. I bump into her in the hospital occasionally when I'm making calls, and I always thought she was a nurse, but she's a microbiologist, is that right? And so in spite of the fact that the house is not quite finished, she was able to get a job as a microbiologist in South Carolina. So they are leaving, and this is their last day. And so we hate to see John go. But John, you go with our blessings and our prayers for you. And we thank you for all the things that you have done for our church. He sings in the choir, he plays the trumpet. It's disgusting, isn't it? Good morning again to you. There are 3 stories that I want to tell you today. The first story many of you may have heard before, but I tell it today for a different reason. And you should also know that I tell this story with the person's permission. I don't like to tell stories about other people without having their permission, but I have permission on this story. It centers on one of my calls that I made. I called on a lady in our church, and it's nice to know that you're welcome. You know, some calls you make and, uh-oh, here comes the preacher. But in this case, when I got there, the lady was just ecstatic. And she said, "Oh, Pastor Frank, I am so happy to see you. You came at the right day. You came at the right time. There's a confession that I have to make, and I am so glad you are here." Well, I'm not used to people saying they have to make a confession to me. But I sat down to listen to her confession. And she said to me, "Now before I tell you, you must swear to me that you will tell no one. If you tell anyone, I will be so embarrassed, I don't know what I would do with my life." So I swore to her that I would tell no one. So she proceeded to tell me her story and to get it off of her chest. And she said, "This morning after breakfast, it was a cold winter day. You know, cold for Florida isn't quite cold, but it was one of the colder days in Florida. And she said, after breakfast, I came back to my room. Promise you won't tell anyone?" She said it was cold, and I looked at my bed, and I decided to go back to bed and take a nap. She said, "Don't tell anyone. I was not raised that way. My parents would have a fit if they thought I went back to bed. Please, don't tell anyone." Now, I need to tell you, this lady is 100 years old. 100 years old, so guilty that she was going back to bed early on a cold winter's morning, fearful that her friends would find out because she wasn't raised that way. And I said to myself, I would have thought that somewhere in our life, I don't know where, but somewhere in our life, we get to that point where we really don't care what you think. But here's a 100-year-old lady who was really concerned as to what other people thought. Now, I don't know what you would have told her, but what I told her was, how about if I go back to our church and I tell everyone, and we will pass a rule at Oakhurst United Methodist Church which says, when you hit 100 years old, you can do whatever you please. And so she said to me, would you do that for me? So I came back and told people, some of you I'm sure remember, I came back and was telling the story. And before I finished, someone in the back row, I don't know who it was, shouted, I so move. And the congregation immediately said, aye. So I went back to her and told her that at our church, we now have a rule that when you hit 100 years old, you can do exactly as you please. Why do I tell you that story? I tell you that story because I continually encounter people who carry guilt that I would call false guilt, who carry guilt over a ton of things that they have no control over. I know people who are guilty about how their parents turned out in life. I know people who are guilty about how their children have turned out. I know people who are guilty about how they turned out. I know people who are guilty about how their neighbors have turned out. I know people who are guilty for all kinds of things that they have no control over. People who are guilty about how they turn out. That's one story I wanted to share with you. We all carry what I would call false guilt, based on all the times in your life you have heard, you should, you shouldn't, you must, you ought not, etc., etc., etc. And we think we outgrow that, and we don't. Even to the point of being 100 years old and feeling guilty for going back to sleep on a cold winter morning. That's one story. Here's the second. The second one happens to be my favorite biblical story. And it's not only my favorite biblical story, it's the story that hooked me when I was a young fellow, became interested in the gospel of Christ and started to read the scriptures. And to start to read the scriptures, it's kind of a hard book to read and understand, particularly when you're young and you didn't know anything. But I read the story of Joseph. And I want to read a portion to you, but I also want to give you the context. It's in Genesis, and I would suggest, I know some of you are Bible readers, some of you are not Bible readers. If you're not, in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, about the 37th chapter, is a story of Joseph. By a little bit of background, Joseph's father is a man named Jacob. And Jacob, in his travels, encounters a woman that he wants to marry. And he asks permission from the woman's father, and the father, his future father-in-law, says, "You must work for me for 7 years if you want to marry my daughter." So he commits himself to 7 years to marry the daughter. On the wedding night, the father switches the women in the room. And he finds himself not with the woman that he loved and wanted to marry, but with the woman's sister. So the father says, "Now you have a wife, but it's not the wife you wanted." So the man's stuck. He wants to know what he has to do for the other woman, the one he wants. The father says, "You must work for me another 7 years." So the man ends up with 2 wives. And they're sisters. Find that attractive? And it turns out that the sister that he didn't want to marry is able to have children. The one that he wanted to marry is not able to have children. But eventually, after several sons are born, the woman that he marries has a child, and that child's name is Joseph. And so there are these brothers from the same father, but different mothers. Do you think, or would you think, that Jacob would have a favorite son? How many think he would? He does. You hear all kinds of things about you shouldn't have favorite children. But he does. He has a favorite child because he has a favorite wife. And the custom of the time is that the oldest son is the one who inherits. How do you determine who is the oldest son? From which wife? And so you show signs of who is going to inherit, and he chooses Joseph. The youngest son, but the oldest son from the wife that he loves. And he shows that by giving him this coat of many colors. And the other brothers, oh, they hate him. You hear about sibling rivalry? They do not like the fact that their father dotes over the youngest child. In so many ways declares him to be the oldest child, but definitely the favorite child. That's the background to the story. Let me pick up and read a little bit. So Joseph went out after his brothers, and they found him near Dothan. And when they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let us kill him and throw him into these cisterns, and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we will see what becomes of his dreams." And one of the brothers says, "Don't shed any blood. Throw him in the cistern here in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, that richly ornamental robe he was wearing, and they took him and they threw him in the cistern. Now the cistern was empty, so there was no water in it. And as they all sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. The camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. And one of the brothers, Judah, said to his brothers, "What do we have to gain if we kill our brother? Come, let us sell him. We'll sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he's our brother. He's our own flesh and blood." And the brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brother pulled Joseph up out of the cistern, and they sold him for 20 shekels of silver. And then these dear brothers take his coat of many colors, they take a sheet, they put the blood all over the thing, and they go to their father, and they take the coat to the father, and they say, "Poor, poor Joseph. An animal must have devoured him. This is all that remains, his blood-stained coat." And their father breaks into tears and cries and cries and cries and cries. I often wonder what was harder to do, sell the brother or tell a lie to their father. Well, that's a different kind of guilt. And here's my point on this guilt. 20 years pass. The family and all these brothers are out of food. There's a famine in the land. And the father sends them to Egypt in order to beg for food. Will Pharaoh, in his mercy, sell them food? So they go to Egypt, they take their money, and who do they have to beg for food from? Their little brother Joseph, whom they do not recognize, who speaks to them through a translator. And in this humbling moment, Reuben, the one who says, "Let us sell our brother," Reuben says, "Do you know why we have reached this tragic moment? This tragedy has entered our lives because of the day that we sold our brother." And here's my point with this. There are times when tragedy will hit our lives. And rightly or wrongly, we connect the dots. And we say to ourselves, this evil has hit us because of the evil that we have done 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. There's such a thing as guilt that doesn't leave us. We all go through that. Rightly or wrongly, we go through that. That's my second story. Here's my third. Years ago, I did a small research project. Small's really the wrong term. Tiny, eeny-weeny would be a better term for it. But in the study of guilt, I borrowed from a professor this is a long time ago, an old lie detector test. It was about machine. It was about this big. Had a couple wires with a needle, a couple wires that went into tubes that I filled with some solution. The salines, I forgot the solution that I put into it. And it was designed so that you took two fingers and you put your two fingers into this little lie detector test. And I tested 6 people. And I'll show you what the test was. It was really minor. I'm going to give you, these are playing cards. Let me show you what this test was. These are 10 cards. I'm going to ask you to pick one. You can show your wife and the people behind you. Just don't show me. Stick it back in there anywhere. I don't want to see it. Okay, did you see the card? And here was the test. I'm going to show you each card. And I'm going to ask you to say, no, that wasn't the card. All right? This one? This one? Yeah, I'm kind of far away here. No. Okay. There's about 10 cards there. But he lied on one of them, right? Did you catch him lying? Out of the 6 people that I tested, I was able to catch 5 people lying. And this is about as emotionally insignificant as you can get. And here's my point. Your body knows. If I were able to catch 5 people out of 6, your body knows that you have lied. And this is totally insignificant when you compare it to going to your father and saying, your brother, my brother, your son, was eaten by a wild animal and died. And you had to listen to your father cry year in and year out over his lost, loved son. Guilt stays with us. Why do I tell you these 3 stories? False guilt, true guilt, and why it sticks with our body. Our communion service. is the time to get rid of all of that stuff. We have a small confession on those things that we have done, that we shouldn't have done. That includes the false guilt as well as the real guilt. We confess that there are things that we should have done that we didn't do. It's the time to get rid of it. And we all carry stuff that interferes with our living. And that's not the way it is intended. So my hope is in the future, as we have communion services or as you live your life, that you not carry excess baggage around and take the blame. We all have enough blame for things that we did do. Don't carry all the blame for things that we did not do and that we do not have control over. Let us pray. Our Father in our living, may the redemption of your Son cleanse us from it all, so that we can live a life and do all the good things because we want to do, to be of service in the world in which we live. Not because we have to do it, to try to cleanse our guilt that you have already cleansed. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. So stand with me now as we sing our hymn, To Touch.